Hi everyone, it's Bella, and today I want to share with you 5 classic novels that I've read recently that I think are pretty underrated, that I don't see too many people talking about. These 5 books are books that I've read within this year, and a few of them are from my book club, Athenian Reads, which is a book club centered around queer classic literature. It's really awesome. If you want to check it out, I'll leave some more information in the description, and I also have a video up here that explains it, so do join. It's really fun. But yeah, a couple of these books are from that book club, and while all of these books are fairly well known and have really cemented their place as classic literature, I feel that I don't really see these books being talked about in a lot of online literary spaces. And I really want to share my thoughts on them and kind of bring these books into the forefront so that more people will read them. If you do not know me already, my name is Isabella, and I am passionate about classic literature, specifically queer and LGBTQ classic literature, so if that's something you're interested in, do stick around. I'd love to have you here. Okay, so the first book we are going to be discussing is Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh. This is a book that I've read recently and fallen in absolute love with, and I noticed that I don't really see very many people discussing it, and I really want to share my thoughts because this is one of the most well thought out, layered, and deeply complex novels that I've ever read thematically. There's so much going on in terms of theme. This book deals with issues of class, religion, queerness, self-identity, self-loathing, family dynamics, and even war. To give you an idea of what this is about, this chronicles the life of Charles Ryder from his days at Oxford in the 1920s all the way up to the start of World War II in the 1940s. And it goes along his life as he interacts with the family who lives in this magnificent estate called Brideshead, and specifically his relationship with one of the family members, Sebastian Flight. And it starts with their meeting at Oxford. The descriptions are so idyllic and beautiful, and it describes their friendship in such a youthful and innocent way. These two characters are so complex right off the bat, and I think the beginning is probably my favorite part of the novel because you really don't see a lot of relationships like this in literature. It's a very deeply queer and homoerotic relationship that Charles and Sebastian have, and especially the way it's written, it's very romantic, even though it isn't outwardly and explicitly stated. This is very much considered to be a queer classic novel for a reason. And this book very much deals with themes that other queer novels deal with as well, such as religion, self-identity, and even self-hatred at times. I also wanted to mention that the character Sebastian is probably one of my favorite characters in literature. We meet Sebastian when he is in Oxford. He's very much a peculiar character, and he's described as very kind of strange and whimsical and aloof. He carries around this teddy bear that makes him look very childish, but Charles is very intrigued by that. In this book, Sebastian deals with a very complicated relationship with his family and also with Catholicism and religion in general. Charles in this book is an atheist and Sebastian is Catholic. His whole family is very deeply religious in that way. Every single character in this book very much struggle with their religious identity, which I think is one of the very, very prominent themes of this book. I believe the author himself described this book as being about religion. One of the major things that this book does really well is talk about class. The way this book describes the family at Brideshead is very interesting. They're extremely upper class, extremely wealthy, and while it describes them in a positive way at times, it also reveals the very ugly truths of being upper class and kind of the mindset of these people as being very close-minded and part of a very problematic system. And especially it's interesting how at the beginning, when Charles and Sebastian are first becoming friends, Sebastian really insists that he doesn't want Charles to interact with his family at all because he knows how this wealth has sort of corrupted them and made them into not very good people, and Sebastian knew that if Charles were to interact with the family that he too would be corrupted, which is very interesting because you kind of see how that happens throughout the novel. how Charles kind of descends into a very unsatisfying life. And without spoiling anything, we do kind of see the character of Charles kind of descend into a life that is very different from the character that we see from the beginning. He is very unhappy with his life and he feels very unfulfilled. And this book asks a lot of questions as to why Charles is so unhappy and depressed with his life while being amidst such extravagant wealth and social standing. Overall, this is just such a fascinating kind of societal analysis. In addition to being a really beautiful queer novel, it just contains multitudes, and it really is one of the most interesting classics that I've ever read. It's very difficult and hard to get through at times. It really is such a phenomenal book that I would recommend to anybody. Next, we have Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit by Jeanette Winterson. I only just finished this book a couple weeks ago. It is so beautiful. It's a very short novel, but it absolutely punches you in the gut. This book is semi-autographical and describes loosely the upbringing of Jeanette Winterson's own life. The main character in this book is also called Jeanette, and this book details how Jeanette grew up in an evangelical religious community in England in the 1960s. We see this religious community through the perspective of a very young child who was very much brought up to serve the church as kind of her primary purpose in life. And as the character grows up and begins to understand her identity as a lesbian, she has to grapple with her faith and her sexuality and how these things can or cannot coexist. One of the things that is very interesting about this novel is that there isn't a lot of themes of internalized homophobia. The character in this book really accepts herself as she is, instead of grappling with any sort of hatred for herself, which is something that I don't see in queer literature a lot of the time. She has this sort of immediate acceptance, and she does this amidst asking questions within herself about the very fragile structure that is modern religion. This book is also really funny. It's so witty at times and clever, and especially at the parts where Jeanette is a child, we see this hypocrisy within the church displayed in a very hilarious way, which I found really endearing. This book also has one of the most fascinating mother-daughter dynamics that I've ever read. Her mother is very fire and brimstone, very devoted to her church, and we see how Jeanette's mother's love for God is above the love for her own daughter, and how Jeanette kind of deals with that. This is absolutely worth a read, and I don't see very many people talking about it on here, but it really is just so wonderful and I would highly recommend it. And next we have another lesbian novel. I've been reading a lot of lesbian literature this year, and I don't have my copy of this book with me, but it is The Price of Salt or Carol by Patricia Highsmith. So a lot of you may be familiar with this story through its film called Carol, which is an extremely beautiful cult classic film that I really enjoy. And I didn't know that there was a book, and this book also happens to be one of the most kind of formative queer novels of the whole 20th century. But still, I see more people talking about the movie than I do about the book, and I read this book in January this year, and I really need to talk about it because it was just so good. So if you're not familiar with The Price of Salt or Carol, this book is about a young girl named Therese who lives in New York City in the 1950s. So Therese, while working in a department store in New York during Christmas time, she instantly meets and falls in love with Carol, who was a customer at the store. And once Therese meets Carol, they're instantly transfixed with each other. And while I usually don't find this kind of insta-love, love at first sight scenario very interesting to read, this book does it in such a unique way, and it doesn't feel forced or unnatural. Their connection feels so real, and these characters are so thought-provoking and very well fleshed out. And as these two women meet and begin to get to know each other, you really learn a lot about the inner workings of these characters. And while not a lot happens in this book plot-wise, it is a very character-driven work that does a lot to explore the very deep emotional complexities of not only the protagonist Therese, we also learn so much about Carol as well, and she's presented as this kind of mystical, mysterious figure, but still we see her in such a human way through her relationship with her family. I love to read books that are beautifully written, interwoven with incredible prose, and this book is absolutely one of them. I think the writing style is one of my favorite parts of this book. Patricia Highsmith is such an incredible writer who really has the ability to kind of grip you and make you feel something, and through making this book have a happy ending, it was just so impactful for the queer community, and it really changed the standard of lesbian novels from being tragedies and cautionary tales to stories about self-acceptance and love. I think it's just really cool how this book is one of the first novels that allowed queer women to read a book about themselves that celebrates their identities rather than thwarts against it. So yeah, this is a really great book. I don't see very many people talking about it, and I would highly recommend it. The next book is The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall. I still feel in kind of the broad scope of classic literature, this book is really overlooked, and being the really incredible novel that it is, I really want to contribute to bringing this book to the modern audience. I think the blurb on the back of this book is really great at kind of describing what it's about, so I'm going to read that to you. The Well of Loneliness is a timeless story of a lesbian couple's struggle to be accepted by polite society. When an unconventional woman named Stephen Gordon falls in love with an ingenue named Mary, their love affair gives Stephen her first taste of happiness. However, the pleasure they find in each other is quickly tarnished by the disapproval of friends and family who refuse to welcome the scandalous couple in their homes. But the most difficult test of the women's love for each other comes when a young man offers to give Mary the respectability that Stephen cannot. So this book is another kind of semi-autographical book that details a lot of events that happened in Radcliffe Hall's own life. This novel really was so revolutionary because it's one of the first books to really condemn homophobia and write about lesbianism in a positive way. The Well of Loneliness really is such an interesting kind of insight and look into a very early period of queer history, especially when reading a book that is set so early on from a lot of other queer novels that we find out there. It is just so interesting to see how, very similar to Morris actually, how queerness interacts with early 20th century society at large. It was an insight that was just so incredibly valuable for me and gave me such an incredible historical perspective. And it gives you a very real character put into very real situations. While it doesn't give us a very particularly happy conclusion, it still makes sense within the story. And for that reason, I can't get mad at this book, especially with how early it was published. It really was such a trailblazing piece of work, and I really want to see more people talking about it, especially today. This has been one of the most famous lesbian novels for a very long time, and I feel like I'm only just recently kind of seeing people start to talk about it more again, and I really want to contribute to that conversation because while this is definitely a very difficult classic to get through, it's so worth it to me, and I really would recommend it. So lastly, we have a book that was recommended to me by a friend. We did a book swap, and I don't think I would have read this book otherwise. I've heard of it and I've seen it around, but I really haven't really heard anybody talk about this book, and that is A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. This is a really big book. It took me a couple of days to get through it, and I went into this book with absolutely no expectations at all. I didn't know what it was about. All I knew was from reading the back that it's about a young girl with immigrant parents growing up in Brooklyn, New York in the early 1900s. The American immigrant experience isn't something that I've read a lot about in literature before. I'm sure it is very widely represented. What I also found very interesting is that this book doesn't follow a very specific plot line. It's very realistic in that the things that happen would very easily happen to anybody. This book feels like a snapshot of moments of a girl growing up kind of strung together, almost like a diary in a way. And that kind of story structure can be really great at times, but other times it can feel kind of meandering without any kind of purpose. But I think where this book really shines is its character work. The main character and protagonist of this book, Francie, is a young girl who is extremely smart and driven and really strives towards education and rising above her position of poverty that she was born into. This book really puts a lot of things into perspective for me. I don't know a whole lot about my ancestors. I am an American. I don't really know a lot about my family who immigrated here, but this book really makes me feel a lot more connected with my past. And especially through the character of Francie, I totally connected with her. She's so witty and smart and has such a good heart. And it was really beautiful to see how, kind of just like the tree metaphor in this book, how there's a tree in front of her apartment building and how despite concrete and everything, it still manages to grow, how she herself is able to grow. I also really enjoyed the very specific historical details. The images that I get from this book were so clear in my brain. This is one of those books, people say this a lot, but it really feels like you're reading a movie. The images this book invokes are just so precise. This book reminds me a lot of Little Women, except the character in this one is a lot more solitary and lonely, but the family dynamics are still very much there. So if you like classics like that, I think you would really like this one. And those are all of the books that I have for you. Those were 5 kind of underrated classic books that I feel like you should know about. I really try to stay active within online book communities, see what people are talking about, and especially in the classic literature niche, I really want to see more people talk about these books. I read all of these very recently and they're just so wonderful that if any of these caught your attention, I would highly encourage you to add them to your TBR. I hope you all are having a lovely week so far, and if you want to see more videos like this from me, you can stick around and subscribe. It would be so lovely to have you here. So until the next one, I'll see you guys soon.